There's an area pastor who, when he was a student here at the college where I teach, minored in communication, and I think from time to time he even listens to this. Not too long after the presidential election last November, he deactivated his Facebook. And I'm going to be perfectly blunt here and say at the time I thought he was overreacting. This weekend I deactivated mine. Some things happened, and the story I'm about to tell, it's going to seem a little self-absorbed and a little self-pitying, but near the end I will get to the application of it because I think it does have relevance to what is happening with some of the pathologies of community that I'm still trying to figure out. Today is the 10-year anniversary of the day I arrived in the town where I now live. And so a few months back, I planned a get-together at a pizza place. And this particular pizza place has significance because twice a year I round up my students, I invite them all to come to this pizza place, and the pizza is paid for, and we just have these get-togethers to try to develop some group identity. So this time I reached out to former students of mine, and not all my former students. I had a hand-picked list of people that, for one reason or another, had made a special contribution to making those past 10 years really, really as enjoyable as they have been. And when I say a few months back I set this up, some of them live out of town, and so it would involve a trip. But everybody on that list, as far as I knew, from time to time came back to the town where I live, either because they have family here or because they have errands they run here. And so I thought that maybe with a lot of advance notice, they could arrange things to where what I had planned would overlap a trip that they were going to make anyway. I think I invited 7 or 8 people, and I think 5 said either firmly or tentatively, but leaning in the direction that they were going to come to it. And that sounded good to me. And I got my hopes up, got kind of excited about it. And then a couple of the people who'd said tentatively they might come, they weren't able to come. And then more and more people had life happen and they weren't able to come. And I saw the entire thing I had planned more or less evaporate. And I got very sad about that. I never married. I have no kids. And I am not too far from turning 50. And a very common thing a lot of people do at this point in life is take stock. And I have been very, very invested in the lives of the people that I teach. So I suffer along with them when they struggle. I take a lot of joy in their milestones. And when I put some thought and some effort into making this event come together, and then it all just fell apart, I thought, when do I get to have a milestone? When is it that my life actually, when I reach a point where I can look back at my life and I can take stock of all these changes and developments, I can close a chapter on my life. Not really close it, because my life continues pretty much as before. But when do I get to do that? And I felt really, really kind of heavy and really kind of down about that, which was silly for several reasons. Reason number one, everybody had perfectly reasonable explanations for why they were canceling. There was one person who got in a car accident, and he lives out of town, and he didn't have a car, and he wasn't able to come, and it's as simple as that. There was another who got sick. There was one who got his days mixed up, and there was a wedding the same day. And you might think that that would tempt me to at least roll my eyes a little bit, but funny thing about getting dates mixed up, just the previous weekend, one of my students had invited me to her wedding and even actually had me participate a little bit in it by doing the scripture reading. So then what do? I wound up entering a half marathon that was the same day, and I didn't notice that until about a week before the wedding. And obviously I just sort of ate the entry fee, didn't go to the half marathon, went to the wedding instead. And then, even the morning of this event at the pizza place, there was one student who was coming to town who arranged to have breakfast with me, and I completely forgot about that. And I'm not really in a good position to get aggravated at other people for getting dates mixed up if I do it that commonly, if I manage to do it twice in a period of about 8 days. So I understood no individual person stood back and thought, this is unimportant to me and it'll be really hurtful to him if I don't show up. Instead, a whole lot of people all intended to make it if they could, and in some fluke fashion, in what I might call a crap jackpot, I just happened to have a day where everything lined up to keep just about everybody away. And one of the things that I teach my students, I teach gracious attribution. When you don't know what's really behind people's motives in behaving a certain way, pick the motive that's the easiest to forgive. It is possible that one or two people got right down to the event and thought, you know what, I don't want to. And that some of the explanations that I heard were not completely on the level. But I have the choice to believe that, or to believe that they were being honest with me. And the easier one to let go of, and the easier one to say, oh well, didn't happen. Life is like that sometimes. I'm not 3 years old anymore. I am resilient, and I can weather that. That's the better way to proceed. That's the first reason that I was being silly. The second reason that I was being silly, I mentioned the person that I stood up for breakfast that day. One student actually did make it, and it is very important that I not downplay how meaningful and really how wonderful it was, because I went to the pizza place with the one student, and also one of my colleagues at the university showed up, and the three of us had about an hour-long conversation, and then the colleague took off, and the student and I talked for a while longer, and the student had brought along a handwritten note, which honestly was so warm and so wonderful that it has already become one of my prized possessions, and I would run back into a burning building for that note. And then the third reason that it was silly for me to get that heavy over this falling apart was, honestly, this was kind of a dumb idea. I mean, I have built my teaching career on, when it needs doing, being blunt with people about things that they don't really want to face up to, so I need to be blunt with myself as well. I made the decision not to get married. I made the decision not to have kids. I benefit a lot from the lack of complication in my life, but I've known all along that there's a price I pay as well. And that price is a lot of solitude. And most of the time I'm very comfortable with solitude and I enjoy it. But from time to time there's a downside to it. And hiding from that is not going to get me anywhere. This milestone in my life was not as important to these people, and that's simply a fact. And playing ostrich about it is childish. More importantly, far more importantly, Robert Putnam very clearly would call this a data point. Robert Putnam was the sociologist who wrote Bowling Alone, who made a lot of observations about declining social capital in the United States. And he would say that me having it made very clear to me that I did not have as strong a ties with the people that I had singled out in my life, that those ties were not as strong as I thought they were. That really that was a wake-up call, and a healthy one. I was treating what were, probably putting these relationships into one of two buckets and saying they're either a weak tie or a strong tie. I think that oversimplifies it. I think I could call these moderately strong ties, but I think that what I was doing was I was treating them as though they were fully strong ties, and I think that distortion was a result of the way that I use Facebook. And this is an ongoing problem. It's been an ongoing problem for a very long time. I have fairly unhealthy behaviors around Facebook. And I think that may be in part driven by the fact that I do not go home to a spouse and kids every night. And so whatever need I have for contact, mostly that need for contact is completely taken care of by the day that I spend teaching. I have this very intense contact with people that I think the world of. But it's also in a very limited window of the day, and there are also long stretches of the year, the summer, Christmas, when I'm almost completely cut off from that supply of contact. Now, years and years ago, back when I had hundreds of Facebook friends, just like everybody else, I realized I was hovering over Facebook. I was almost nursing off Facebook. I would go back over and over again to see if there was anything new in my feed, if there was anything anyone put up that I could in some way respond to and get a little moment of human contact. And here I should mention, for all my invoking of Sherry Turkle, my behaviors showed that I was treating that as though that human contact was equal to genuine human contact. When I know, I can explain, I can make it very vivid that it is not the kind of valuable, meaningful human contact that makes people healthier. This is an explanation. I did a version of it last week, but I'm going to do it again because I'm rehearsing it, because it's going to become lecture material in a couple of my classes this fall. There was a book a few years back, and I need to nail down the name of the author. I was looking at it just the other day, called Sweet, Salt, Fat, and it talked about the food industry and about how manufacturers of fast food and junk food have learned how to take sweet flavors, salty flavors, and the mouthfeel of fat, things like cheese, and they've learned how to mix them in just the right proportions to where the wired-in survival instincts we have, those are harnessed to make us crave these foods. And if we crave them, then we're going to lay out our money for them, and we're going to come back repeatedly for them. And then there is pornography, which takes a normal sexual arousal response. It pulls the particular visual elements that trigger that response out of their context and concentrates them, essentializes them, and then what it does is it sells as a commodity, triggering that arousal over and over again on command, until, plucked out of its context, it becomes this very, very consuming, destructive, unhealthy experience. Now, following on those two examples, here's the third example. Jean Twenge, I'm probably pronouncing her name wrong, she is a psychology professor at San Diego State University, and a number of years back, she made it into the headlines with her research showing that over time, people's scores on measures of narcissism were going up. Now, a lot of people misunderstand narcissism. It may be that I'm going to get some of these details wrong because I'm not a clinician, I'm not a counselor, psychology is not even my field. But the misconception that a lot of people have, they hear the word narcissism and they think that it is just pathologically high self-esteem, that it's just weaponized conceit, that boy, do you think you are the best person in the world if you're narcissistic. And a better explanation for it might be addiction to praise. And if you are addicted to praise, if you crave affirmation, if you have to have people praise you and you have to brag all the time, it might look as though you are Guinness Book of World Records in love with yourself. But another way to understand it might be you've got this pit, this bottomless pit inside you, this black hole. And it hurts. And your instincts tell you that if you get praised more and more, if you get other people's adulation more and more, it might fill that up. So along come Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and there's this thing called the like button, which is the sweet, salt, fat, or the pornography of affirmation. Before there were social networking platforms, there was praise. Definitely there was praise and social support, and they were in the context of a relationship. They were in the context of an experience. But in the same way food manufacturers pull sweet, salty, and fat out of our diet from the past, where they were incidental, where your idea of sweet might be berries that you plucked off a bramble, but today it's death by chocolate. When you take likes, and you can at a glance see how many likes you got on your post, that's essentializing and concentrating that, and it's raising our threshold for being satisfied until a lot of us have this black hole inside ourselves, this pit, and we try to fill it with these concentrated affirmations. And just as pornography can raise what it takes to arouse you to where you cannot have, or you have a much harder time having a healthy relationship with a normal-looking romantic partner, after a while, when you've been in the arms race to get likes or to get favorites on Twitter, to get retweets on Twitter, whatever it happens to be, when the praise is a simple mechanical act and it's quantified, then it becomes an addiction. It becomes the kind of thing that you can't metabolize. It becomes a thing that's not surrounded by the context that it used to be surrounded by. It's not buffered. It's not measured out in smaller doses with a lot of normal human experience in between. One of the things that happened, one of the conclusions I reached about this whole thing I tried to stage at Tracktown was, I look at Facebook and I see a lot of people's milestones. They had this quality, I couldn't really settle on the word, and last night when I was trying to fall asleep, it finally hit me. They're spectacular. And by spectacular, I mean the first level meaning of that word. They are a spectacle. And the example that popped into my head was a lot of people now, when they are proposing to the person they want to marry, they have to try to stage it and make it very elaborate, almost to where it could become a viral video, to where it resembles viral videos that get passed around. Like, what's his name who proposed to his girlfriend in Disneyland, and then it turns out the whole thing was something that Disney had staged as a clever marketing campaign. But we are driven in the direction, I think, of, instead of the events in our lives being ordinary, instead of them being wrapped up in context, we think we have to essentialize them. We think we have to amp them up, concentrate them, because we've lost the subtle palate. You eat too much junk food, or you subsist on a diet of cotton candy for too long, and when you eat good food made out of fresh ingredients from recipes that have withstood the test of time, they just don't taste like much. Or you consume enough pornography, to go back to that example, and then you come back to a perfectly lovable but not surgically enhanced romantic partner, and you just can't get aroused. They look too ordinary. Gene Twenge has an article in this month's Atlantic Monthly, and I plan to assign it in a couple of my classes. The title of the article is, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" And she has taken a lot of separate studies and findings and woven them together. And in particular, she talks about suicide rates. And things that I had treated as, those are worrisome, those are probably not good for me. More and more, this is crystallizing, and it was really turning into a wake-up call. I mentioned before that I was almost nursing on Facebook, and that I, like everybody else, I had my 600, 800 Facebook friends. Well, I trimmed it down, and I cut it down at the time to about 60. And I put a limit. I said, I will not go over 100 Facebook friends. If I add Facebook friends, I have to cut others off. And my rule became, I will friend my family members, because that's how I keep up with them. And I will friend my alums that I used to teach, because that's how I keep up with them, and that helps me do my job better. And for a while it worked, because it meant there was so little activity in my feed that it wasn't very interesting. So through large parts of the day, I could leave it alone. It was kind of like LinkedIn. LinkedIn has always bored me to death. But little by little, I backslid, and I started hovering over it again, especially in the summer. And I should mention that, as I record this, today is the last day of my summer vacation. Tomorrow, I am back at work. I have my first faculty meeting of the fall, and then it's off to the races, which, by the way, makes this a really, really good moment for me to have this wake-up call. Last week, in a burst of frustration because I was getting so little done on prepping my classes, I did something I hadn't done in 2 or 3 years. I logged out of Facebook. Most of the time I stay logged in, and if I wanted to see what was going on, I'd just open a tab and go to the page. But I logged out. And for a day or two, I was so much more productive. And then I got to the end of the day, and I didn't have anything else I needed to get done. So I let myself log back in to see if anything interesting had come up. And pretty soon, I had stayed logged in for a couple more days, and I was once again not being productive. So Saturday afternoon arrives. This event that I'd gotten all excited about has fallen apart. I start to understand that I had this distorted view of its potential in the first place, and it got its hooks into me and got my expectations raised to where it hurt when those expectations fell, largely because of what I had trained myself to do by misusing Facebook and by not being decisive about limiting its unhealthy influence on me. Here I should mention that in 1996, 21 years ago, I don't even remember what my motive was at the time, but I called up the cable company and I had them shut off the cable. And I have never since had a working television in my home. And I have told the story over and over and over again that the first few days and the first few weeks felt very unfamiliar and very uncomfortable. But after about 6 months, maybe to a year, I noticed my attention span was better, my memory was better, my moods were more even. It was the best choice I ever made. And now I have reached a point where I am feeling downright stubborn about the fact that this deactivation, this opting out of Facebook, I want to make this permanent. Now, what does this have to do with community? I think it has a couple of things. The first thing is the unbalancing of relationships is one of the biggest forces that is keeping our communities unhealthy. And I think what Jean Twenge's review of these research findings about use of phones and use of social networking, she makes a case that is scary enough, troubling enough, that I am starting to wake up in the middle of the night and stare at the ceiling again and think, what kind of world are we making for ourselves? And this phenomenon, I think, is intertwined a lot with the pathologies of extreme frustration, cynicism, and despair, that people do not feel that they have a shot. People do not feel that they are secure. People do not feel that they are making progress, and therefore they are distrustful of their leaders. And a big part of that is that they use platforms like Facebook and they see what's going on in other people's lives, and I think that is adding fuel to the fire. That's one of the things that has to do with community. But the second thing is, I mentioned this in some of the first couple of episodes of this podcast. Trump's election was, to me, the repainting of highway signs with bright, glowing paint. And what I mean by that is, I knew there were problems with income inequality. I knew that a lot of people were very frustrated and alienated by social change, and there was a lot of simmering anger and resentment out there. I knew it, but I thought it was the kind of thing that we needed to get around to dealing with one of these days. And one of the silver linings I tried to find after the election was, well, now it's impossible to ignore. So now we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and go to work on it. And this wake-up call, this disappointment in this event that never happened, and this sudden change in how I feel about Facebook and in my intent about what to do with it in the future. And I have never had an active Twitter or Instagram account. I did sign up for both of them just to make sure nobody else could have my name, because that way lies danger. But I've never gotten sucked into either of those, and LinkedIn, of course, has no entertainment value at all. But I got right to the point. The timing is absolutely wonderful. The timing is so good that it almost feels like a God thing, like God being good to me, because tomorrow, when the first faculty meetings happen, and then in a couple of weeks when I am once again teaching a zillion students, I have so much to keep me occupied that it will be easy for me to stay away from Facebook. Now, it's going to be trickier when we get to December, and trickier still when I get to next May. But I have a lot of time to work on the side to figure out how to do solitude well. That, by the way, is something Sherry Turkle talks a lot about. If you can learn how to do solitude well, then that can have some really, really rich dividends for how your relationships go when you are around people. So, it turns out I do not think that my pastor friend and former student, I no longer think that he was overreacting when he deactivated his Facebook. And as I have often said, most teaching is delayed reaction, and he really did teach me a lesson. It just took a whole bunch of months for that lesson to sink in, for its wisdom to become apparent.